Greetings. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Mroz-Sailer, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Hannah Wilson will be speaking about what's in a scream, how do bats respond to distress calls made by other species. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the areas and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Before we begin, I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with Native Prairie conservation or species at risk. Join us on October 6th for a presentation by Kayla Caruso, an MSc candidate at the University of Saskatchewan, and she will be talking about migratory birds at Chaplin Lake. And stay tuned for details about our winter webinar lineup. You can register for Native Prairie Speaker Series webinars on the PCAP website, and all past presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/user/PCAP. And this presentation will be uploaded there in the near future. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, just type it into the questions section of the webinar dashboard at any time, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar presentation. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, Eco-Friendly West, Enbridge, Information Services Corporation, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, SaskTel, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. In-kind support has been provided by the University of Regina. Now a bit about today's presenter. Hannah Wilson is a student at the University of Regina studying bat behavior. She graduated from UC Berkeley in 2018 with a BA in Integrative Biology and spent some time working in China and Oklahoma before moving back to Canada to begin her Master's of Science. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Hannah. That I will pass it over to Hannah.
Awesome. All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Caitlin, for that very nice introduction. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how bats respond to distress calls made by other species of bats, but to be honest, more accurately, I'm going to be talking to you about why distress calls matter, why we bother to study them, and then a little bit about why we're studying them in bats in particular. And then I'll talk a little bit about my project, which is how do bats respond to distress calls made by other species of bats, and basically do bats respond to distress calls by species of bats here. But before I do that, I do want to add on to what Caitlin said earlier and acknowledge that I do work at the University of Regina, which is situated on Treaty 4 lands. And then all of my work was also done in Cypress Hills and Provincial Park. And I lived like 5 minutes away from Fort Walsh, which was one of the signing points of Treaty 4. And Cypress Hills in particular was an important meeting point for many Indigenous nations, and I wouldn't be in Cypress or be able to be in Cypress without Indigenous peoples being there first. So when we talk about Cypress, I think we think about Cypress as a place of natural beauty and ecological importance, and don't always take the time to learn about its cultural and historical significance as well. And so before I start my presentation, I do think, while I'm going to talk about it and its ecological importance, it's important to also learn about its cultural and historical importance as well. I also just want to take time to acknowledge the people I worked with this summer. So unfortunately, the best picture I have of my master's advisor, Mark, is the very far away photo with the car in the background at the bottom. And then everybody else in this picture in this slide are people I worked with this summer. And I just would not have been able to do any of the work that I did without them. They are so important to me, given just advice or just the work they put in this summer and getting wet and standing in ponds late at night, getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. They are just hugely important. And if you get a chance, Emma is a master's student as well, Dana is a PhD student. If you can get a chance to learn about their work, I would highly recommend it. They are brilliant people. So first things first, what is a distress call? So a distress call is an acoustic signal that an animal makes when it is in immediate danger or when it thinks it's in immediate danger. And humans make it too. So a distress call is essentially a scream. For adults will make a distress call when they're directly under attack or if they're in a process of being attacked. So for bats, if I'm holding a bat in my hand and it thinks it's gonna die, then that's gonna make a distress call. But for baby animals, juveniles will also make a distress call if they're just lost and confused and they don't know what's happening. It's basically just to help me. And when I was first learning about distress calls, what I was confused about is what is the point of making a call when you're under attack if it's just going to bring more attention to you? So if you're making a distress call, that gives a chance for other predators to know where you are and know that you're potentially injured. So what is the point of making a distress call? And for the caller, there are three big hypotheses. So the first is the startle predator hypothesis. And that says that essentially, if you scream in somebody's face, they're more likely to get startled and let you go. So the idea is that a scream is to give you a chance to escape because the predator will be startled and let you go. It also can potentially be a physiological response. So screaming can trigger an adrenal response in the caller's body so it's easier for them to escape. And when a caller makes a distress call, they can also potentially be warning nearby kin, so relatives nearby, that there is danger, don't get eaten. The benefit of that is that if a caller thinks it's already going to die, there's no chance of it surviving and there's no chance of it reproducing and passing along its genetics. Potentially, if it has relatives nearby, those relatives can hear its warning, survive, and then manage to escape. So the caller is still gaining indirect fitness. So it's still being able to pass along its genes via its siblings, cousins, parents. Conversely, a caller could also be making a distress call to attract listeners to it. And it's kind of the opposite of warn kin, because rather than telling people to go away, you're attracting people to please help you. And that makes sense for members of the same species or members of the same family, so conspecifics, because they also want to increase their indirect fitness, so the chance of them passing along their genes, not through their own methods, but through their cousins, by saving a member of their own species. It also could be to scare away a shared predator that they know could attack them next. So that makes sense for conspecifics, so members of the same species. But when an animal makes a distress call, it's not just members of that animal species that are hearing the call. It's a whole bunch of different animals and a whole bunch of different species. So if an animal eavesdrops on that call, if it hears it, what could their reactions possibly be? And they can do nothing, which is most of the time. They can run away, they can investigate the source of the call, or they can mob the attacker. And do nothing is the most common response when an animal hears a distress call. So think about when you're walking around and you hear a bird calling, or if you hear a mouse chirping. That could potentially be a distress or alarm call, but you're not reacting to it because A, you don't know what it is, or B, you know it doesn't matter to you. So that's the same thing, not just for humans, but for a bunch of different animals. They're not going to react or change their behavior when they hear a distress call because they either don't know what it is or they don't care. It doesn't matter to them. But the three other responses for me are a little bit more interesting. So the first thing they can do is flee. So they could run or fly away. And that's most likely to happen when the animal that's listening to the call is also going to be in immediate danger and has a higher fear of being eaten by the predator that is attacking the source of the call. So you see this in nature a lot with, in Australia, there was a example of birds in a mixed flock. So birds of many different species all in a flock together. When a fairy wren would call, honey eaters would fly away and vice versa. And you also see that with mammals too. So macaques will flee in response when they hear a deer alarm or distress call, and red squirrels will actually do the same thing to blue jays. And the reason they're doing that is because they share these similar predators, and they have a high likelihood of being attacked by that predator after the caller has already either been eaten or has escaped. On the other hand, a heterospecific animal can also choose to mob the attacker, so they can attack whatever is causing the source of the call. And this is more likely when heterospecific, so members of two different species, share similar habitats, they share predators, and they have a lower chance of being attacked as well. So essentially, if the mobber has allies, and so you can see this as well in mixed bird flocks. If a bird has allies, they're more likely to mob whatever's attacking the distress caller. And then there's also a really good example with chickadees and nuthatches. So chickadees have a distress call that they make when they're being attacked, and nuthatches, which are different species of birds, will go ahead and mob whatever's attacking the chickadee. And this is really interesting because essentially they're sharing similar habitats and they share predators. So it's a benefit to the nuthatch to chase away a chickadee predator because it tells the predator that it is not easy to get food here, so please stay away. However, it also puts an animal at an extreme risk of danger when they mob an attacker. They are more likely to be hurt. So the other thing that animals can do is that they can investigate the source of a distress call. So this means that rather than going ahead and attacking whatever's calling, they just get a little bit closer, see what's happening, and then either stay at a safe distance or then go away. So again, you see this with songbirds in North America. If you play a predator or a hawk call, sometimes, and if you play a mobbing call afterwards or a distress call afterwards, songbirds will get a little bit closer, and when the distress call gets too loud, they'll go away or they'll flee. You see that with bats in South America as well. So bats that share a same day roost, if they hear a distress call, will pass by if they're of a different species, but they're not going to mob. They'll just see what's happening. So essentially what they're doing is they're checking out what this danger could be. So again, this happens when animals share similar predators or if they share similar habitat, but they could still be in danger of being attacked. So you see this more often with animals when they're solitary or if they don't travel in large groups, because you are at a larger risk of getting attacked when a predator can focus on you. So it's beneficial to check it out and figure out what's happening in your area, but it's not beneficial to go ahead and attack whatever is a danger to you. So the 4 responses when an animal of a different species hears a distress call is do nothing. That's most of the time. They can flee, they can mob the attacker, mob an attacker, or they can investigate the source of the distress call. That's great. Who cares? So first things first, the listener cares. And then because of that, we care too. So essentially when a member of a different species reacts to any distress call, it's adding to the amount of information they have about the environment around them. And the more information an animal has about its surrounding environment, the greater the likelihood of its survival is going to be. So the more likely it will survive to have babies and pass on its genes. And so that adds to something called the ecology of information and increases an animal's chance of its own fitness. For us, it's important because it tells us how different species value each other's signals, which can help us understand where an animal is within an ecosystem. So what trophic level is it in? Is it an important predator? Is it more towards the bottom of the ecosystem? It tells us where an animal is in the ecosystem, and it tells them how different species matter to each other. From a conservation perspective, and from kind of an educational perspective, it kind of just reminds us that species don't exist in a vacuum. They require each other to survive and to pass on their genes. And the more we learn about how threatened species in particular value its neighbors' acoustic signals or value any signals, it tells us what we can do as conservation biologists to help maintain a species' survival. So that's why distress calls are important. Basically, it tells us more about how species interact with where they live and interact with the other species in the area. It tells us a little bit more about a species ecology, which in turn can help us conserve threatened species. However, I don't know if you noticed, but when I was talking about distress calls and what potential responses there are to distress calls, a lot of that information came from bird research. And that tends to be true in general. A lot of acoustic signaling research is done in birds, which makes sense. They're really cool and they're also very easy to study. But what that means is that all of our knowledge about how animals respond to distress calls or acoustic signals in general comes from birds. And we can't be sure that applies to other orders and other species until we actually do the research there too. And bats are a really interesting subject case because like birds, they can fly. And like birds, acoustics are very important to bats, but they are A, mammals, and B, nocturnal. So they face very different threats than birds do. And so by applying bird theories based in bird research to bats, we can then figure out whether these theories that we've come up with are applicable in a wider context. So again, why bats in particular? Bats are the second largest mammal order in the world. So what that means is basically there are about 5,400 species of mammals in the world over. And this pie chart on the left tells us the diversity of each order. And so there are about 1,400 species of bats out of the 5,000 mammal species there are in the world. So they're hugely diverse. Bats are absolutely everywhere. They can be really, really big. They can be really, really small. They're also the only true flying mammal. So they're the only mammal that can fly consistently in their own power. And because they're so diverse and because there are so many different species of bats, they're a really good place to start testing the viability of big theories, because we can test them in a bunch of different places across a bunch of different species. And if those theories hold up, so if an animal in great danger of being attacked by something does run away when they hear a distress call, that tells us, okay, if bats do that too, do the same thing as birds, in that theory, the animals will flee when they hear a heterospecific distress call holds up. That's true. So that is that's why bats are an important place to start talking about distress calls and talking about big theories. And in North America, the bats we have here are all nocturnal, for the most part, are all nocturnal. And the bats we have in Saskatchewan in particular are all insectivores. So they all eat insects. They're all nocturnal, and they all use echolocation to find their food. So they're all already using acoustic signaling to find prey items. And I think most people are familiar with the concept of echolocation, so I'm not going to spend that much time on it. But as a quick recap, echolocation calls are very high frequency calls, and bats will make a call and listen to the echoes from that call to figure out where food is. And bats tend to give out ultrasonic calls, so basically humans can't hear them. And the higher frequency the call a bat projects, the shorter distance it can travel. So lower frequency calls travel farther, can be heard by more things, pick up more things, but they're not as specific. So if a bat is trying to find a very small piece of prey, they're going to call at a higher frequency. And different bat species can not only call at different frequencies, they can also hear at different frequencies. But just because they're calling or hearing at a specific frequency doesn't mean that they can't call at lower frequencies. So for example, this bat here, this is a little brown bat call, and it's calling at about 40 kilohertz, but they can make social calls, lower calls at much lower frequencies, so at 15, 20 kilohertz. And they would call at lower frequencies when they are actually actively trying to communicate with other animals, when they're trying to pass on a message. The reason that you would make a social call, a lower call at a lower frequency, is because it can be heard by a lot more things. So it's supposed to be heard by other animals. So here I have two sonograms of a little brown bat call. The top call is an echolocation call. So that is the call this little brown bat will make when it's trying to find food. As you can see, it's about the frequency, the most power. So basically where the sonogram looks a little bit more yellow is about at 40 kilohertz, and the maximum frequency is about 80. It doesn't go that much lower than 40. So, and it's pretty evenly spaced. On the other hand, this distress call is a social call. It's meant to communicate information. You can see that the red here on the sonogram below is where the most power is in the call, and it's about 20 kilohertz. But not only that, you can see harmonics around it, so that green area around it is also sound that is projected. And you can see it goes up to 120 kilohertz and above, and it goes down to about 0 kilohertz. And as people, the highest frequency we can hear is about 15 kilohertz. So basically what this means is that we can hear a distress call and we can't hear an echolocation call. And because it's so broadband, it doesn't just mean that we can hear it, it means that a whole bunch of other species can hear it. Everything can hear this distress call. So even though maybe it's not meant to, but other animals can eavesdrop on the call and gain information about it. So with my project, given that distress calls can be so widely broadcast and so many things can hear it, my question was threefold. One, are bats attracted to distress calls by other species? So would they gain information by getting closer to a distress call and investigating it? 2, are they able to distinguish between different species distress calls? So are they able to see if one species of bat is calling versus another? And then are there species-specific differences to the bat's response? So what that means is a bigger bat responding differently to a smaller bat's call than the smaller bat is responding to the bigger bat's call? And more specifically, my project focused on three of the most common species that we find in Cyprus. The silver-haired bat, so that's this bat on the far left, the hoary bat, which is in the middle, and then the little brown bat, which is on the far right. So all of these bats use the Cyprus hills as a breeding ground. So they're all there during the summer having babies. They're all using Cyprus as a place to roost and also as a place to hunt. So we think that these bats are using Battle Creek, which is the creek that runs through the Cypress Hills West Block, as kind of as a flyway, which is essentially a bat highway, but instead of cars, it's bats flying along a creek. And they're using that to get from roosting sites to hunting sites, or they're hunting along the creek itself. All of these bats are insectivorous. They're all nocturnal. They're all using the same approximate habitat to find prey. But the hoary bat in the middle is 3 times as big as the little brown bat, and it calls at about 20-ish kilohertz, 15 to 20 kilohertz. Little brown bat calls at about 40 kilohertz echolocation calls, and then the silver-haired bat calls about 30 kilohertz. The hoary bat is also about 3 times bigger than the little brown bat and 2.5 times bigger than the silver-haired bat. But the silver-haired bat and the hoary bat we think share pretty similar diets, and that's slightly separate from the little brown bat. To learn more about the diets of all these 3 bats, I would totally recommend you look up my friend Dana's talk that she gave to this body like a year ago, and she's very knowledgeable about that. So these 3 bats have similar habitats, they share similar predators, they fly at around the same spot, but they have very different life histories. And they have different prey, different sizes. There are different items about them. So it makes them a very interesting case study to study how they respond to each other's distress calls. So for that first question of, are bats attracted to distress calls by different species of bats? So basically what that means are the little brown bat, the hoary bat, and silver-haired bats attracted to each other's distress calls? My thought would be, yes, they are. And I thought specifically that they'd be more likely to investigate each other's distress calls to check because they share similar predators. Question 2 was, are they able to distinguish between different species distress calls? My hypothesis there was hopeful that I thought they should be. And the reason for that is because when you have these bats in hands, you can hear them making distress calls. And to my human ears, they sound extremely different. So I suspected that to bats, they would sound even more different. And then the third question was, are there species-specific differences? So are these 3 different species of bats responding differently to each other's calls? And I thought that the hoary bat, being the biggest species, would have a lower risk of predation from potential predators, and so they'd be more likely to respond to all 3 species calls versus the little brown bat, which is the smallest. And so when it's being put, it is increasing its risk of danger by being attracted to larger bat distress calls and putting itself at a greater risk of predation. The other thing is that hoary bats have been known to be aggressive towards other bat species. And so if a hoary bat is giving out a distress call and other hoary bats are likely to listen in and be attracted to a hoary bat distress call, I thought that a little brown bat might want to avoid that area and risk being attacked not just by whatever's attacking the caller, but also by other hoary bats that are hanging around. So the first thing I did for this project was I wanted to collect distress calls from hoary bats, silver-haired bats, and little brown bats. So as I mentioned before, all these bats are using Battle Creek as a flyway, we think, to find food. And so generally what we do when we catch bats is we set up these giant mist nets across Battle Creek. And at night, as you can see on the picture on the right, they're basically invisible without a light. And the strings that make up this mist net are really, really small. So with echolocation, higher frequencies find smaller items. And because these strings are so small, the hope is that it's going to be harder for these bats to see the mist net until they're too close and they hit it. So after we caught bats in a mist net, we used an acoustic detector to record the distress calls of these bats when we had them in hand, and then created those calls, made them all nice and fancy and got rid of the noise, and then wanted to rebroadcast those calls out. Here's the problem. We wanted to broadcast those calls out to see how different species of bats responded to this distress call. And we didn't want to put mist nets over Battle Creek or do it across Battle Creek because we know that bats are already flying over Battle Creek. So if we're playing distress calls and we're hearing bats on our acoustic detectors or catching bats when we play back distress calls, we don't know if they're actually responding to a distress call or if the bats just happen to be flying over Battle Creek at that time. So instead, we decided to use a different method. And I have a picture of what this looks like in person in the next slide, but I wanted to show you this because it makes a little bit more sense in my opinion. So what we did is we had we placed these mist nets and our acoustic detectors parallel to Battle Creek, and we put them about 5 meters away. The reason we did that is because if a bat hears a distress call, it will take some effort to veer off their course, off Battle Creek, to check out where this distress call source is. So we placed a speaker at the bottom, we placed an acoustic detector there, and the idea is that the acoustic detector can capture information about bats that are flying around but maybe not getting so close. So we can basically hear if bat activity increases when we play back distress calls. And then we also put a mist net about 30 centimeters in front of our speaker. The reason that we did that is because we assumed that if bats were getting 30 centimeters away from a speaker, that might be showing that they're not just investigating a call, but they're actually mobbing. They're actually mobbing a speaker. And if you see that in a header-specific context, that would be very interesting. So in person, this ended up looking like this. So you can see the acoustic detector microphone on top. It's on top of a 1 meter pole. The speaker's at the bottom, and the mist net goes through the middle. The mist net is not fully up at this time, so you can kind of see it, which I think it makes it a little bit easier. One thing I think it's important to note about our speakers is that we assumed that because we could hear the distress calls when we had the bats in hand, the most of the power of these distress calls were at a level that humans could hear, so about 15 kilohertz. And we talked to people and figured that we could use essentially the best way to explain it is a shower speaker or a party speaker. So just a regular speaker that you can buy from Best Buy and use that to broadcast distress calls. Unfortunately, we ran into a problem pretty much immediately after we started broadcasting distress calls. And the reason for that is when we collected the distress calls in the first place, these are 3 sonograms of a little brown distress call on top, a hoary bat distress call in the middle, and a silver-haired bat distress call at the bottom. The white line is about where most of the power in the call was, so basically where the call was loudest. The red line on these diagrams is the highest range, basically, of what humans can hear. So what was happening is that we assumed that most of the power in these calls would be at the red line or below the red line, and it turns out most of the power in distress calls is above it. And more than that, these calls are also super broadband. So we did not realize when we first recorded these calls how wide the frequencies were going to be. So we didn't realize that little brown bats were going to be able to produce distress calls at over 100 kilohertz. And most frustratingly, we didn't realize that the silver-haired bat distress call would be almost entirely ultrasonic. So basically, we can't hear that at all. And that ended up being a problem because our speakers were not broadcasting anything over 20 kilohertz. So this first sonogram up top is the raw distress call that we collected from our acoustic detector. And the second sonogram at the bottom from the speaker is what the speaker was actually broadcasting. And so you can see that the speaker's really not broadcasting anything that's over 20 kilohertz. And there are some harmonics that are going higher, but it's not nearly the full call. And so that's a problem because this project ended up being our bats responding to calls made by other bats that humans can also hear, but it's not the full call. So in order to troubleshoot that, what we tried to do is have one night with no distress calls playing at all and compare that to nights that we did play back distress calls and just see if there was a difference between those 2 nights. And the idea there would be, okay, so does it matter that do bats need the full structure of a distress call in order to respond to a call? Does that matter? And so next year, what we're hoping is that we can get speakers that produce ultrasonic frequencies. And so we can compare how bats react to a full call versus how they're responding to just a call that's audible to human ears. But luckily, we have the solution to these problems, and we still have a ton of acoustic recordings, and we have all these different calls that have these structures of what these distress calls look like, and which tells us some really interesting information. So for silverhead bats, yeah, it was really annoying that it turned out that these calls were mostly ultrasonic, but because their distress calls are mostly ultrasonic, that could tell us that these bats don't actually want all the animals in the vicinity to hear their distress call. It could say that they're only trying to attract silver-haired bats to their distress calls, or they're only trying to attract other bat species to their distress calls. And then that brings up the question is, why is that different for hoary bats? Why are they calling so low? And why are little brown bats calling so low? So the sonogram on the right is again a hoary bat call. The sonogram on the bottom left is again a little brown bat call. The other question there is, why are hoary bat calls and little brown bat calls so much more broadband? Why do they cross such a wide range of frequencies as compared to the silver-haired bat? So there are just a lot more questions that have come up with this project, even though it didn't exactly go the way I wanted it to this year. There are just a lot more questions that we can still ask. And just to recap, so for my first question was, are bats attracted to distress calls by different species of bats? And from this year, we know that maybe they are. The fact that silver-haired bats are calling at such a high frequency suggests that they're not trying to attract at least humans to their distress calls. So maybe. Are bats able to distinguish between different species distress calls? Well, given how distinct each of these distress call structures are and different given where the power is, it seems unlikely that bats wouldn't be able to distinguish between distress calls. If I as a human person can distinguish between 3 different bats distress calls, it would make sense to me that bats are certainly able to do the same. And are there species-specific differences between who is attracted to what call? I haven't properly been able to go through my data properly, and certainly have not been able to do any statistical analyses on them. So the answer, until I can do that, is no idea. And then this fourth question that came up from this year is, do bats need the full structure of a call in order to respond? So does it matter how wide-ranging the frequency is before they can respond to a call? So that is pretty much where we're at right now. That's where this project stops. And I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you learned something about what distress calls are, how bats are, why we're studying them in bats. And I hope you have many more questions about how ultrasonic frequencies work and how social calls work. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, now is the time to ask.
First of all, thank you so much, Hannah. That was a really, really informative presentation, and you're obviously very passionate about your work. So thank you for sharing your enthusiasm with us today. I just wanted to mention, you referenced Dana Green's webinar for our past speaker series. I actually just pulled up the link on YouTube, and I'll send it to everybody now. So that was a really great resource. And we have a few other bat webinars on there as well. So I'll put a pitch out for that too. You can just type in bats into our YouTube channel and all the bat presentations will come up. It is great. Oh, and Dana is also here, she said. That's fantastic. So to any of our listeners, if you have any questions, just type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. So Hannah, why did you decide to study bats in the Cypress Hills area compared to the area nearby?
So, I mean, to be honest, it was mostly practical. Mark, who's my advisor, has worked in Cypress since '91. And so that's where he does most of his research. And then also because we know Cypress has a ton of bats and they have a ton of different species of bats, it just made sense to do the project there.
Yeah, for sure. Mark has also done a webinar for us, I think 1 year around Halloween time, and that'll be on our YouTube channel as well. So how far of a range were you studying? Was it just limited to the Cypress Hills, or did you get as far as East End?
No, it was just limited to the Cypress Hills West Block. So I think it ended up being about 10 kilometers of river.
Okay, perfect. And have you noticed anything about white nose syndrome in that area? I know it's been officially confirmed in Saskatchewan now, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it was actually interesting because we were up in Cypress last year too. and we caught fewer bats last year than we did this year. I think we caught like 20 last year, or yeah, we caught like a third fewer bats. And I know we just sent in our fecal samples to the provincial government, and they're going to do tests to see if white nose syndrome has been found in our bats there. We haven't officially seen anything yet, but I'd be curious to see how the dynamics change next year.
Yeah, for sure. How long does the testing take?
A good question. I don't know. I think if you can talk to Erin Swordfager, I think she's in charge of testing there.
Oh, okay, interesting. I live in Val Marie, so a couple hours east of you, and I found a bat this summer, and I sent it in for testing, and then I got a call from public health to make sure I wore the proper PPE and everything, which is good that they're calling, but it was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
We don't have any questions yet, but I'll give everyone a minute to, if you have any questions for Hannah, feel free to type it in. Oh, there we go. I spoke too soon. Sometimes it takes people a minute. So this is from Lynn. She says, thanks, Hannah. Very interesting talk. Have you found that bat biologists have anecdotes about capturing bats in hand? And then other bats coming in, maybe suggesting they were responding to calls. Not sure if there's anything in the gray literature collating this.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because it's that, to be honest, is how I first became interested in that topic in the first place. Not anything in the literature to my knowledge, but anecdotally, like there's a saying that if you've caught a bat already and you put it in a bag, you can like flick it to make the bat start chattering in order to attract more bats to your miss net. Not something we do anymore, but something that I think people have tried to do in the past. And then there is anecdotal evidence for hoary bats in particular. If you have a hoary bat and they're chattering, I know people have experienced other hoary bats swooping down around them. So yeah, that's kind of how I was curious about that in the first place. I was curious to see if you could replicate that. Especially since it hasn't been replicated in the literature. I think a similar experiment was tried in the 80s or 90s by Brock Fenton, and that experiment you can find online, and that was looking at big browns and little brown bats. And I didn't include big browns in my experiments because they're harder for us to find, we think, in Cyprus. But their conclusions were big browns didn't respond to little brown bat distress calls. But then they also had the same problem that I did, which is that their speakers weren't broadcasting those ultrasonic frequencies. And so I suspect that might be the problem.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Yeah. A listener named Michael asks, how did you come up with the 5-meter distance from the creek?
So I wanted to have a distance that was far enough away that the bats would have to veer off course basically to get towards our speaker. And so it couldn't be so close that that if bats were on the river, we could still hear them, it needed to be close enough to the creek that bats flying across the creek could hear a distress call if it was being broadcast, but it needed to be far enough away that if bats we wouldn't be able to capture bats on the acoustic detector until they were getting closer to the speaker and going off the creek.
Okay. Perfect. Alana is wondering, were you aware of any roosting sites or maternity colonies in the area before deciding on where you set up your nets?
Yeah, so we knew that there was a little brown bat roosting colony in the ranger station in West Block, and some of our sites were around there. Hoary bats don't roost together, so they roost solitarily and they roost in trees. So we're less sure where those roosting sites are, and the same is true for silver-haired bats. Again, anecdotally, based on the types of bats that we're catching at night, you can kind of guess where different roost sites are. But besides the little brown bat, I don't think we know.
Claudia says, awesome presentation, thank you. Just wondering if you noticed whether any particular species, such as nocturnal owls, for example, will respond by calling back.
That's a really good question. I didn't hear any owl calls responding.
Okay.
And I actually didn't see that many owls this year. We do occasionally see them at night, but I didn't notice more of them when I was playing back distress calls versus not. That's a really interesting question, though.
Yeah, yeah, that could be a PhD project. So when will you be finished your master's?
I have one more field season, so I have next summer, and then I have to write it up and do all the data analysis, and then I'll be done.
Okay, perfect. So now you're like, oh yeah, I could do a PhD, but if I were to ask you in a year from now, you're probably
We'll see. Let's see how I feel after I write it.
Yeah. And then an attendee named Leanne just mentioned that those samples likely went to CWHC for testing. And there's a link which I can try to copy and paste and send to everybody. We'll see if this works. There you go. And so that's probably where the where bats went testing, or the bats sample went for testing. And unfortunately, the bat that I sent, I did get the results back that it was not suitable for testing. I think it was a warm summer day, and yeah, but we have white nose in our area now, so I wanted to make sure that went in. Sorry, back to the questions. Annette is wondering, what are the predators for the little brown bats?
Owls are a big one. A lot of bats, rather than when they're in flight, but when they're in their roost, can be attacked by snakes. I mean, also, cats are always going to be a huge problem, so keep your cats indoors. But I think a lot of bat predators tend to be stuff that's found in roost rather than stuff that's found when they're flying around, because they can fly and so they can escape a lot of predators. But owls are the biggest one. And
Okay.
people.
And would an owl attack an entire roost, or would they go after like an individual bat?
I don't think an owl would bother to attack an entire roost. It wouldn't make a ton of sense. I think they'd go after an individual bat.
Okay. Okay. And you mentioned snakes. Do you know which species?
That's a great question. I don't know specifically. I imagine that I imagine that any snake that would be able to get into a roost and get a bat that's not flying yet would go for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have bull snakes down where I live, but I'm trying to envision like how they would get upwards. But yeah, no, snakes are very creative.
Yes, yes, I love snakes.
Yeah.
They're so cool.
Yeah, they are for sure. We did a snake webinar a year ago, but there's not a lot of snake researchers out there right now. I'll find a few.
Yeah, I think way less in Saskatchewan than there are. Where I did my undergrad, there were a lot of reptile biologists, which makes sense because California and southern United States.
For sure. Yeah. So Susan is wondering, have you seen a recent paper that found a bat alarm call in the net sounded like an insect, possibly mimicking bees? And Susan says, I think it was a UK study.
That's so cool. Okay, I have not seen that, but I'm going to look it up. That's actually, let me write that down.
Yeah.
I'm going to look that up.
Perfect. Annette's wondering, are the little brown bats in danger? Is there anything we can do to help?
So they are federally endangered in Canada. That is mostly because of white nose syndrome, and basically white nose is a fungus that is in caves where these little browns overwinter. And when it gets into the little browns, what it does is when these bats are trying to hibernate, they keep waking up, so they lose a lot. So they just lose energy, and so they don't have enough fat to maintain their fat stores over winter. And so because of that, they essentially die of starvation. But because white nose is a fungus, there's not a whole lot we can do to fix that. White nose has been around since about 2006. And we can't just, put fungicide in caves, because there's a lot of beneficial fungus in caves that are important, not just for bats, but for other species. So we can't just add fungicide to a cave. And then there's also the fact that bats with white nose can travel to different caves. So that's how white nose is spreading now. And then infect that cave. So we don't actually know. Basically, they're mostly affected by white nose, and there's not a whole lot we can do about that.
Yeah. We've had some webinars in the past to There was a man out of, I think it was University of Winnipeg or University of Manitoba, Craig, and he's
yeah,
had a lot of publicity. Yeah, yeah. And he did a whole thing about white nose syndrome. They talked about some of the stuff that they've been trying, but you know, it's, and this was a webinar well before COVID. And so, you know, you can't get bats to social distance, and you can't like block off a cave and say it's contaminated now. And they've tried to, you know, cleanse the caves, and no luck yet, unfortunately. And yeah, I know University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Jeff Lane and Brandon Berta, they've both done presentations for us in the recent past too about white nose syndrome in Saskatchewan now, and kind of keeping an eye out for it and reaching out to landowners who may have bats on their land to kind of keep an eye out, and if they notice anything to report it and that sort of thing. So yeah, what are your thoughts about bat houses?
I love bat houses. I think they're really awesome.
Yeah,
I think they're great. I think if you have property and you can put a bat house up on your property, definitely do it.
Yeah, yeah. I did mine as a COVID project. I don't have any residents yet, but I think it's because they have like lots of good habitat nearby me. Like there's an old garage and an old hockey arena that's being used as habitat. So why would they leave that for my little bat house if they're happy where they are? But one day if they get kicked out, it's there and ready for them. Yeah, perfect. So this kind of brings us to the end of our presentation. And oh, sorry, got another question pop in. So Alana says, it's a little bit off topic, but still bat related. Are you aware of any urban movements, maybe nonprofits, towards changing streetlight shapes to increase the amount of dark skies available for bats?
I am not. I'm sure there are. The interesting thing is, last year, I don't think this has been published yet, but we had a couple people in our lab do an honors project, or an independent research project about whether bats were affected by city lights. And I think the consensus ended up being it depends on the species. So I think hoary bats were less likely to be in cities versus little browns and big browns didn't seem to care as much. I need to double check on that. But yeah. I don't know, because bats also use city lights because insects are attracted to lights. Insects will fly around lights. And so if you walk through Regina, you can see, and I'm sure the same is true at Saskatoon, you can see a lot of bats around city lights, just getting insects there. So I'm not sure if that necessarily bothers them so much. Besides, it's still a risk of predation, but I don't know if the bats avoid bright lights.
Yeah, that's a great question. We've had a couple presentations about dark sky preserves. One was in Alberta, and then we had an astronomer do a presentation like 5-6 years ago now. It's a good reminder to have somebody else come talk. And they talked about there's a light pollution abatement committee in Regina and Saskatoon that are kind of working with the city to try to use like dark sky friendly lighting. But it's interesting that you chose Cypress Hills because it is a dark sky preserve, and probably one of the largest and darkest ones in Canada. So yeah, makes sense. There's lots of bats there. Yeah, and now I've got I'll have to make a note of that. I also made notes too that in the future I'll have to reach out to Emma and Louisa for webinars.
Yeah, Emma and Dana, and I think Josh too. He also just did his honors project about bat diets.
Okay, awesome. I'm always looking for people. If anyone ever has suggestions, I'm happy to take them. You said Josh?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. I will look him up. Yeah, so I think that's all the questions that we have right now. But Hannah, I just wanted to thank you so much for great presentation today, and again for sharing your enthusiasm and passion for bats with us. And you know, at PCAP we do several bat webinars a year, and we just can't get enough of them. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
To all of our attendees, thanks so much for catching today's presentation. We had, I think, almost 80 people on the line for the live broadcast. If you missed it, or if you know someone who missed it, it'll be on PCAP's YouTube channel in the near future. And when you leave today's webinar, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey that'll pop up. So if you don't mind answering that, it just takes a quick minute, and then we can report back so we can keep our Native Prairie Speaker Series going into the future. And don't forget to join us next week on October 6th. Kayla Caruso with the University of Saskatchewan will be talking about migratory birds chaplain. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.